In the summer of 1997, Apple Computer was 90 days from death. Cash reserves were bleeding out at a rate that terrified the board. The stock had collapsed to around $5 a split-adjusted share. Wired magazine had already run a cover screaming the word "pray" in giant letters above a corroded Apple logo wrapped in barbed wire. Inside the Cupertino headquarters, employees were quietly updating their resumes, certain the company that built the Macintosh would not survive the year. Michael Dell, then the king of the PC industry, was asked at an investor conference what he would do if he ran Apple. He laughed into the microphone and said he would shut it down and give the money back to the shareholders. Nobody in that room defended Apple. Nobody thought he was wrong. And yet, 27 years later, that same company would become the first business in human history to be valued at $3 trillion. This is the story of how a dying computer maker, abandoned by Wall Street and mocked by its rivals, engineered the greatest corporate comeback the world has ever witnessed. It is a story about a man who was fired from his own company, a desperate phone call to a sworn enemy, a forbidden product that almost was not built, and a quiet obsession with details that nobody else thought mattered. Welcome to Titan Codex, where empires are dissected. Today we open the file on Apple. To understand the resurrection, you have to understand the death. By the mid-1990s, Apple had become a museum of missed opportunities. The Macintosh, once revolutionary, was being undercut on price and outpaced on speed by cheaper Windows machines flooding every office on Earth. Apple had tried to respond with chaos. Engineers were running 15 different product lines simultaneously, building Performas and Quadras and Centruses and PowerBooks with overlapping features and confusing names. A customer walking into a store could not tell which Mac was supposed to be better than the other Mac sitting 6 inches away on the same shelf. Internally, the company had become a feudal kingdom of warring factions. The operating system team had been promising a next-generation replacement called Copeland for years, burning hundreds of millions of dollars without ever shipping anything that worked. The hardware divisions blamed the software teams. The software teams blamed marketing. Marketing blamed the CEO, and the CEO, Gil Amelio, who had taken the job only 18 months earlier, was discovering that the bleeding was far worse than the board had told him before he signed the contract. Apple had lost over $800 million in a single quarter. Suppliers were demanding cash up front. Retailers were quietly cutting shelf space. The brand that had once promised to put a dent in the universe was being slowly erased from it. Industry analysts began openly debating which larger company would buy Apple's bones for cheap. Sun Microsystems was rumored to be circling. IBM was mentioned. Even Sony had quietly studied the numbers. The cultural memory of the original Macintosh, the friendly machine that had launched 1,000 magazine covers in 1984, felt like ancient history to a generation of buyers who had grown up on Windows 95 and saw Apple as a stubborn relic clinging to a losing platform. Worse, the developers were leaving. Software studios that had once built exclusively for the Mac were quietly porting their products to Windows and letting their Mac versions rot. Each defection made the platform a little less attractive to the next developer, and each missing piece of software made the platform a little less attractive to the next customer. It was a death spiral, and everyone inside the company could feel it tightening. Emilio knew he could not fix the operating system disaster from inside. So he went shopping. He needed a modern foundation to replace the broken Copeland project, and there were only two real candidates on the market. One was a company called B, founded by a former Apple executive named Jean-Louis Gasset, offering an elegant new system called BOS. The other was a small, struggling outfit in Redwood City called Next, run by a man Apple had thrown out of its own building 12 years earlier. His name was Steve Jobs. Gasset, sensing Apple's desperation, demanded a price north of $200 million and a seat on the board. He overplayed his hand. Jobs, by contrast, walked into the negotiations with a different kind of leverage. He did not just offer software, he offered himself. Apple agreed to acquire Next for around $400 million in cash and stock. The deal closed in February 1997. Officially, Steve Jobs was returning as an advisor. Unofficially, every person in that building understood what had just happened. The founder had come home, and he had not come home to advise. For the first 6 months, Jobs moved like a shadow. He sat in meetings, asked questions, and said almost nothing. He was studying the corpse, learning where every organ had failed. Then, in July, he made his move. He convinced the board to remove Gil Amelio. Within weeks, he had pushed out most of the existing directors and installed his own allies, including Larry Ellison of Oracle. He took the title of interim CEO, a deliberately temporary label he would keep for over 2 years, partly as a joke and partly as cover. The first thing he did stunned the industry. He picked up a phone and called Bill Gates. Microsoft, at that moment, was the empire that had crushed Apple in the operating system wars. To Mac loyalists, Gates was a villain, on the level of a comic book antagonist. And Jobs asked him for money. He asked Microsoft to invest $150 million in Apple stock and to publicly commit to keep building Microsoft Office for the Macintosh for the next 5 years. In exchange, Apple would drop a long-running patent lawsuit and make Internet Explorer the default browser on the Mac. The deal was announced live at the Macworld Expo in Boston in August 1997. When Bill Gates appeared on a giant screen behind Jobs, the audience of Apple faithful actually booed. Jobs let them. Then he explained, with a calmness that bordered on cold, that the era of Apple having to win for Microsoft to lose was over. Apple had to be healthy on its own terms. The boos turned slowly into stunned silence. The deal saved the company's credibility overnight. But money was only oxygen. Jobs needed to fix the lungs. He walked into a conference room with his senior team and drew a simple 2x2 grid on a whiteboard. Across the top, he wrote Consumer and Pro. Down the side, he wrote Desktop and Portable. 4 boxes. He turned to the room and said this was the entire product line going forward. 4 computers. Not 40. Anything that did not fit into one of those 4 boxes was to be killed immediately. He canceled the Newton handheld, a product he reportedly disliked for personal reasons. He killed the printer business. He killed the Apple-branded servers. He killed clone licensing, the program that had allowed other manufacturers to build Mac-compatible computers, even though it meant buying back contracts at enormous cost. He cut over 70% of the products in development. Engineers who had spent years on canceled projects were either redeployed to the 4 surviving boxes or shown the door. The grid became law, and inside that the consumer desktop box, a small team began working on something that did not yet have a name. It would eventually be called the iMac. Jobs gave that team a near impossible deadline and an even more uncomfortable instruction. He told them the machine had to be something a person would want to have in their kitchen, not their basement. It had to look less like office equipment and more like an appliance, less like a tool and more like a friend. Engineers who had spent their entire careers thinking in beige and gray were suddenly being asked to think in color, in curves, in translucence. Most of them had never been asked questions like that before. Some of them quit. The ones who stayed began to understand that Jobs was not really running a computer company anymore. He was running a design company that happened to ship computers. The iMac arrived in May 1998, and it looked like nothing else on a computer store shelf. It was a single curved shell of translucent blue plastic called Bondi Blue after a beach in Australia. You could see the circuit boards glowing faintly through the case. It had no floppy drive, a decision critics called insane at the time. It had a strange new port called USB that almost no peripheral in the world yet supported. It came with a round mouse that nobody could orient correctly in the dark. By every traditional measure of personal computer design, it was wrong. and it sold. It sold 800,000 units in its first 139 days since Apple posted its first profitable year since the disaster began. The stock, which had been trading in the single digits, doubled and then doubled again. But the iMac did something more important than make money. It told the world that Apple was no longer a company that built beige rectangles for accountants. It was a company that believed objects could be beautiful, that technology could be friendly, that a computer could be the kind of thing you actually wanted to look at in your living room. The aesthetic revolution had begun, and the man leading the design of that revolution, working quietly in a studio behind locked doors, was a young British industrial designer named Jonathan Ive. Before the story reaches its most crucial chapter, pause for a moment. If you've followed along this far, it means you've been drawn into this style of storytelling. Click the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next Empire stories on Titan Codex. One empire per week, one lesson per empire. Thank you. Back to Apple. By the year 2000, Apple was alive again. But alive is not the same as dominant. The company was still a niche player in personal computers, holding maybe 3 or 4% of the global market. Jobs understood that if Apple stayed only a computer company, it would always be a small computer company, forever vulnerable to the next downturn. He needed a second act. The opportunity arrived through a combination of luck and obsession. In 2000, the music industry was being torn apart by a piece of free software called Napster. Tens of millions of people were suddenly downloading songs without paying for them, and the record labels were panicking. Hardware companies were rushing out clunky, portable music players that held a few dozen songs and had interfaces designed by sadists. Jobs noticed something nobody else seemed to notice. The problem was not the hardware. The problem was that nobody had built the entire chain. Nobody had made one company responsible for the music store, the software that managed your library, the device in your pocket, and the experience of moving a song from one to the other. Apple decided to build all of it. The iPod arrived in October 2001. 1,000 songs in your pocket, a scroll wheel that felt like magic, a white pair of earbuds that became a status symbol on every subway in the world. 2 years later, the iTunes Music Store launched, selling individual tracks for 99 cents each, and the record labels, terrified of Napster, signed deals they would later regret. Within a few years, Apple was selling more music than Walmart. The iPod did something to Apple that the Mac never could. It made the brand mainstream. Suddenly, people who had never touched a Macintosh in their lives were carrying an Apple product everywhere they went. The white earbuds were marketing. The Silhouette commercials were marketing. The very act of pulling an iPod out of your pocket on a bus was marketing. And every one of those new customers became a candidate to one day buy a Mac because the software they used to manage their music, iTunes, taught them that Apple could make things that simply worked. The halo effect kicked in hard. Mac sales, which had been flat for years, began climbing. The retail stores Jobs had launched in 2001, which Wall Street had openly mocked as a vanity project doomed to bankrupt the company, became the highest-grossing retail spaces per square foot in the United States, beating Tiffany and beating luxury jewelers. Apple was no longer a computer company. It was becoming something the business world did not yet have a name for: a consumer electronics company, a software company, a retail company, a media company. All of it bound together by a single obsessive belief that the experience had to feel inevitable. And in a quiet lab in Cupertino, behind doors that even most Apple executives could not enter, a small group of engineers had begun work on a project so secret it was given a code name even inside the building. They were trying to put a computer inside a phone. The internal battles over that project were brutal. 2 competing teams inside Apple were secretly working on different versions of the device, one based on a stretched iPod with a click wheel, the other based on a shrunken Mac with a multi-touch screen. Jobs let them race. Only one would survive, and the engineers on the losing team would have burned a year of their lives for nothing. That was the cost of the obsession, and Jobs considered it acceptable. The iPhone was unveiled on January 9th, 2007, on a stage in San Francisco, and the keynote that day is still studied by communication students around the world. Jobs walked out and told the audience that Apple was launching 3 revolutionary products: a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communicator. He repeated the 3. Then he repeated them again. Then he paused and said, "Are you getting it? These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device, and we are calling it iPhone." The room exploded. What the audience did not know was how close the project had come to never shipping. The software was unstable until weeks before the launch. Engineers had been working 18-hour days, sleeping under their desks, watching their marriages strain. The demo Jobs gave on stage that day was held together with tape. He had to follow a precise sequence of actions called the golden path, because deviating from it would crash the prototype. He pulled it off without a single visible glitch. The iPhone went on sale that June. Within a decade, it would generate more revenue than the entire Microsoft Corporation. It would make Apple the most profitable company in human history. And it would do something even more important than that. It would put Apple inside the pocket of more than 1 billion human beings, every hour of every day, becoming the most intimate piece of technology any company had ever sold. From 2007 onward, the trajectory becomes almost mathematical. The App Store launched in 2008 and created an entire global economy of software developers who paid Apple 30% of every transaction in exchange for access to those billion pockets. The iPad arrived in 2010 and created a tablet category that competitors are still trying to catch. The Apple Watch, AirPods, and a sprawling services business covering iCloud, Apple Music, the App Store, advertising, and payments turned the company into something no analyst had a clean model for. By the time Steve Jobs died in October 2011, the man he had personally chosen as his successor, a quiet operations genius from Alabama named Tim Cook, inherited a company already worth around $350 billion. Many predicted that without Jobs, Apple would coast and then decline, the way so many founder-led companies had before. Instead, under Cook, Apple multiplied. He optimized the supply chain into something that resembled a precision instrument, locking up entire factories years in advance, controlling the flow of components down to the screw. He pushed the services business from a rounding error into a $100 billion engine of pure margin. He turned China into a sales machine, while carefully managing the political complexity of manufacturing there. The market capitalization crossed $1 trillion in 2018. It crossed $2 trillion in 2020. It crossed $3 trillion in 2022. Each of those milestones would have sounded like science fiction to anyone sitting in that 1997 boardroom watching the cash run out. To put the scale into perspective, by the early 2020s, Apple was generating more profit in a single quarter than most Fortune 500 companies generated in an entire year. The cash pile alone, even after enormous share buybacks, regularly exceeded the gross domestic product of medium-sized nations. Apple had also begun designing its own silicon, the M-series chips, breaking a decades-long dependence on Intel and proving that the same obsession with controlling the entire stack could deliver performance that the rest of the industry could not match. The company that Michael Dell had publicly suggested be liquidated for parts had become worth more than the entire economies of most countries on Earth. So what is the actual lesson hidden inside this story? It is tempting to say the lesson is innovation, or design, or marketing, or the genius of a single founder. All of those things matter, but they are not the core. The core is something quieter and harder to imitate. Apple's comeback was built on the radical refusal to do too many things. When Jobs walked back into that company in 1997, he did not save it by adding products. He saved it by killing them. He drew 4 boxes on a whiteboard and told the most talented engineers in the world that 90% of what they were working on no longer existed. Every later triumph, the iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, the services business, the retail stores, all of it grew from soil that had been ruthlessly cleared. The company learned that strategy is not a list of things you will do. Strategy is a list of things you will refuse to do, no matter how tempting, no matter how profitable they might look in a spreadsheet. Apple also learned that the experience is the product, not the chip, not the screen, not the operating system in isolation, but the seamless feeling of all of them disappearing into a single moment when something just works. That obsession with the entire chain, from the silicon to the box it ships in, is the moat no competitor has been able to cross. And finally, Apple learned that comebacks are not built on hope. They are built on focus, on cash discipline, on swallowing your pride to call the enemy who can save you, and on the willingness to bet the entire company on a product nobody asked for. From 90 days from bankruptcy to $3 trillion in market value, Apple's story is the most expensive lesson in corporate history about the price of clarity. If this story rebuilt the way you think about empires, you will want to watch our breakdown of how Microsoft survived its own near-death moment under Satya Nadella, linked right now on the screen. The file on Apple is closed. The vault remains open.